Hey everybody, my name is Parth Garud. So I'm a rising senior at Denmark High School, and at Denmark I'm involved in the Model United Nations, the band, some other activities. For my robotics experience, I was a part of Vex Robotics in middle school, but that's about it. After I graduate, I want to be an aerospace engineer and go to Georgia Tech. So my experience at this camp, first of all, I just like to thank Dr. Grenling and all of the other people who made this program possible. I gained a lot of experience and knowledge through it, and I'm really thankful for that. The base robot we made was a little bit easier than I'd anticipated, so I spent the majority of my time and focus onto my modifications. When I was thinking up of my modifications, my main goal was to optimize both the maneuverability and the drivability of the robot, and I had to keep in mind the project brief that I was on the Mars mission, which would mean that I couldn't really get new supplies easily. I wouldn't have all of the tools that I would like to have with me, and that the robot wouldn't always be around the driver. Another thing I had to keep in mind was that these modifications should actually enhance the effectiveness and the learning that these rover expeditions would bring. The first things I did were just physical improvements to structure. I mostly did these just so the robot would drive a little better, fix any alignment issues, and it would be easier to add my other modifications knowing that I had a strong structure. So on this next slide, I have a couple pictures of what I did. These top two are how I strengthened the front wheels and prevented them from sagging out a little bit, and those bottom pictures are the support I added to the back wheels. After that, I modified the code, and this was mainly to focus on that drivability and maneuverability component. So our base robot really only had two motor groups, the entire left side and the entire right side. So the first thing I did was I kind of split these two into the front left, front right, back left, and back right, so I could code for more advanced maneuverability. And then I added code to the starter code that we'd gotten, so the robot would be able to strafe or move directly horizontally. So there's a video here of that horizontal motion that I could program, and a picture of the circuits that I had to modify in order to make that strafing possible. So the physical modifications I did, I would say that this is where I spent the most of my time. After I first built the robot and started to drive it, the base robot, I realized that it was going a lot slower than I'd expected. And I thought that if this were an actual Mars mission, a lot of these things and a lot of these movements would be time sensitive. So I decided to actually take apart the motors and re-gear them, just keeping in mind that if I was on Mars, I wouldn't really be able to just go out and get new motors. So I could re-gear the motors effectively, and they were about 2.5 times faster, which was a big improvement. I also added a sensor tower, and the component I had in mind here was the fact that the driver won't always be near the robot. So I changed my remote control receiver mount to the top of the sensor tower versus just on top of the battery at the bottom. I also added cameras at different angles so I could basically not have to be in the same room or same area that the robot is in. I'd still be able to drive it pretty well. Lastly, I had an arm that could move up and down, and this arm was capable of many things. It could do more surgical procedures that would be needed on a Mars mission. It could activate buttons and switches, which would also be useful, and in terms of gathering knowledge, it could dig up soil, gather soil samples, and in digging small trenches, could lay the groundworks for future expeditions on Mars. So here are some of the pictures of that actual process. These pictures on the left are the process of regearing that motor, both of the top component and the actual gearbox inside. Then in the middle, there's the arm that I made, and it's all hooked up so it can actually move up and down. And lastly, there is a picture of the sensor tower. The final sensor tower had an additional camera that was facing the back, but I hadn't added that yet just because I didn't have the arm on yet. So my modifications were all successful and I could complete them in time, but it was a lot of work and there were a lot of challenges I faced on the way. The biggest things really were just figuring out how all of the components of this robot worked. I wasn't really familiar with Arduino or some of the circuitry of this robot. So, especially for recoding it, I would say that took a lot of time just sitting down and understanding how Arduino code works, as well as taking apart the motors and finding out how each one of those works, just so I could make the modifications I wanted to make. But all in all of these failures, all of these challenges really helped me learn a lot. So, as I was saying, I'm really grateful for this experience and want to give a big thank you and shout out to all the people who could make it possible, especially our sponsors. I learned a lot of things, both about the hardware components like the circuitry and the motors, as well as the software. It was an entirely new programming language, so that was a bit of a challenge, but I learned a lot about it, and I'm pretty confident in my ability to code Arduino now. I also learned non-technical skills. One of the big things was instructing how I regeared the motors to someone else over a BlueJeans call. It's really hard to explain if the person isn't next to you and you can't really see what they're doing and they can't really see what you're doing. So that's an important thing I learned. And I do have plans to continue working on this robot, adding some more sensors to the sensor tower and coding a section of the program so I could utilize those sensors to enable autonomous activity. So I can take questions now, and if you go to the next slide, there's a video that I'd like to play just of a demonstration of the robot while I do questions.
Kelsey wants to know what kind of cameras did you mount onto your rover?
So my original plan was to use actual remote control cameras, but given the lack of availability of those resources, I ended up using cell phone cameras and then just connected them to my laptop instead of using RC channels.
Lori wanted to know, would you say your previous experience on the robotics team helped you with coming up with modification ideas?
I would say my experience really helped with the regearing of the motors. When I did robotics, our club mentor didn't really want us to spend money on new motors. So we kind of had to make do with the ones we had, and they were all turning at different speeds. So I had to take those all apart and find a way to mix and match the gears to make them all turn at the same speed. But the other modification ideas, uh, I would say were more based around like what I'd seen about different Mars rovers and stuff like that.
So on a related note, Chris wanted to know what sparked the idea for the mechanical pencil as material to help regear the motors.
So when I was regearing the motors, basically what I ended up doing was taking one of the actual gears out of the mechanism completely. And that left a lot of empty space in the gearbox that I needed to fill up with something. And my thought process at that point was if I was on Mars, I wouldn't really have, 3D printing to actually print out the spacers I wanted or any real motor parts. And so I was just thinking of what I could use that was easily available and something that I wouldn't really need special access to in order to make those motors work. And so I figured out that a mechanical pencil, so I actually have the one I use right here. Um, so it's a bit broken now, but basically what I figured out was if you use this outer casing, you can use that. I needed spacers of two sizes, so this outer casing worked really well for the big one, and then the inner lead tube worked really well for the small one. And so it was kind of just something I found out that I could use two components from the same thing, and it would just be a lot more efficient and cost effective that way.
Well, certainly impressive, Parth.
Thank you.
Johnson wants to know what instrument you play in the band.
So I play clarinet in band. I've been playing that since sixth grade, and then uh, since my sophomore year. So I've been in marching band for all of high school, but since my sophomore year, I was drum major. So that is, more leadership and conducting. And then for drumline, I was bass captain. So I played bass too.
Well, a man of many talents.